Hello, and welcome to EZRA Asks, where each episode we at EZRA invite in a special guest, a leading thinker, to help us grapple with a question related to the world of work and professional development. My name is Sinead Keenan, and I'm the Chief Innovation Officer here at EZRA. In today's episode, we're asking the question, is how we communicate in this digital age in sync or out of tune? What are some of those big communication challenges that we face in the workplace? What are some of the key differences between online communication and in person? Are there generational differences that we need to be mindful of? And the power of a specific single word to change the conversation. So many great questions that we're going to be diving into today. And to help us answer some of these important questions, we have the pleasure and privilege of being joined by Professor Haesun Moon. Haesun, welcome to the show. So Haesun, you are a communication scientist, a pracademic. You teach at the University of Toronto at the Institute of Coaching. You are an exec director at the Canadian Centre for Brief Coaching and an esteemed member of EZRA's Science Board. You're also an author. So I know you've written many books, including Thriving Women, Thriving World, my own personal favorite, A to Z, Coaching A to Z, The Extraordinary Power of Ordinary Words. And outside of work, you have quite an eclectic range of interests from filmmaking.
That work is not enough, right?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not sure how you fit all this in. Filmmaking, carpentry, you're an organist. You're a lover of early mornings and naps, and maybe early morning naps, I don't know. Good coffee and fine pens with fine nibs.
Yes, that's correct.
Well, Haesun, welcome to the show, and we are delighted to have you here. So what brought you here to help us grapple with this question on how we communicate in the digital age? Are we in sync or out of tune?
I actually thought, what is different about how humans communicate?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, surprisingly, but not surprisingly, I don't think a lot of things actually changed in how humans communicate. We use different modes and channels, but that intrinsic need for us to connect and also make meanings together, I think it's still pretty much sustaining. And I think the question is, though, things are changing pretty quickly. And what are some things that we should be aware of? Or what are some things that we should maybe intentionally doing differently or more of, or maybe even less of? So I think that might be a very important topic.
Yeah, so much for us to dive into. Before we do that, as you know, at EZRA, we believe in the power of the superpower of coaching. So I'd love to just hear from you. What do you think is your superpower?
My goodness, my superpower in coaching or in general?
In general.
In general, my superpower, I think it's, my musician friend actually just called me something and it's escaping me. But it actually is in opera, there's comedic relief.
Comedic relief?
Yes. So she says, I am actually that in her life. So I have this humor. That in any given point, there's that humor. And I think that's something that I really enjoy. So I usually tell people, I'm not in a good place if I don't have a joke in me.
And having seen you speak, seen you in action, I absolutely believe that. I can see that you always have a way of just seeing the humor in things and really bringing that to life. So yeah, I think that is a wonderful superpower. And just to kind of warm us up a little bit, so we've got a few questions for you, some rapid fire. You don't know what these are, so let's put you on the spot slightly. First question: would you rather? I already know the answer to this. Would you rather cats or dogs?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Dogs, but I also love cats. I do have 2 dogs and a half cat.
A half cat? half what else?
It's a cat, and it comes to my backyard at 4 o'clock every day. I don't know what it is, but we had the time savings change, and then it came at the right time. So
good.
I don't know what's happening. So 2 dogs and half cat.
And half a cat. I'm glad it's not like half cat, half hamster or something else. I thought That's where you're going. Okay. Emojis or GIFs?
Oh, emojis.
Emojis every day. Okay. Reading or audiobook?
Reading.
Reading.
The real book, not even an ebook. Although I have my book and ebook and all those things, but reading. Paper.
Yes. Underlining with your fine
Yes.
pens. Would you rather be always 10 minutes late or 20 minutes early?
20 minutes early.
Okay.
Yes.
Travel 50 years in the past or 50 years into the future?
Do I get to come back though? It depends.
No.
If I get to come back.
No,
Oh,
you're stuck.
I don't.
You're stuck. 50 years in the past or 50 years in the future?
If I go back, then do I still have the knowledge and
Too many questions.
Well, it depends. It depends.
Spoken like a true academic.
I mean, do I go back in? I'm in my age. So anyway, some questions there.
Okay.
But I think I will go back in time.
Back in time. Okay. Last one. Would you rather have the ability to fly or breathe underwater?
Oh. Fly.
Fly. Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. I've learned so much in the last 2 minutes. Now, we talked a little bit just right at the beginning, Haesun, about your interests, your passions, but I'd love to just know, what got you interested in this field of communication science and research? What started you off?
It was not intentional, and a lot of people will tell you that I somehow ended up doing this, and it was actually the case for me too. So I was not intending. I didn't pursue something like this. Actually, in fact, one of my guidance counselors from high school actually told me that back in time when I was 16, that's when I moved to Canada, and I didn't speak English. I spoke French, and I spoke Korean. And my guidance counselor said, what do you want to be? I said, I would like to be a teacher or speaker or something. And she said, you don't speak the language. So I recommend that you choose a career where you don't have to interact with people, but maybe do some like lab work or something like that. So I said, oh, okay. Thank you for your advice. And that's what I did my undergrad studies. I was working in animal lab. I did life science and psychology. And quickly I realized that was not really the career that might be fitting for me. So I think somehow I ended up actually working in social profit organization with people with developmental disability. And I got very interested in staff training and how people learn and how people get better. But I would say my first experience about communication is actually working in that organization where people with developmental disability, often we say that, oh, they don't communicate. Oh, they do. They sure do. But I think, how do we listen in a way that we can actually hear when they're telling us what's important to them? And I think they were probably the clearest communication people that I could actually remember, because it was clear, it was direct, it was honest. So I think that's where I got really interested in communication. Yeah.
And then you started out in doing lots of research, and I think over the years, I'm guessing you've seen lots of changes in terms of what people are focused on in the research and the literature. What are some of the big trends that you've seen?
Well, big trends for sure. When I was doing even psychology, and first time I actually walked into anything to do with coaching is in the context of sports coaching. And I think that's back in 2001, I would say. And it was one of those courses that I walk into, and they talked about this coaching. And it was my first time hearing. I was like, this makes so much sense. And I thought to myself, but this is too simple. It can't be serious. I mean, I come from this life science background. And back then, even the field and also myself, I was very interested in evidence-based and how do we know things work and that kind of diagnostic or reductionistic way of studying. So I think since then, I actually have seen in the last 20 somewhat years, I see that the whole field actually has moved from evidence-based practice to paying attention to practice-based evidence. So
can you explain the difference for us?
The difference will be, for example, Kurt Lewin is a psychologist, I guess. and how he speaks about a very famous saying goes like this: there's nothing more practical than a good theory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I loved it. There's nothing more practical than a good theory and all this research and evidence we gather and that we can actually apply. But I also think over the last 2 decades, I realized there's nothing more theoretical than a good practice.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look at really good practice, for example, solution-focused practice, actually didn't come from theorizing. It came from observing what actually works.
Mm-hmm.
And that good practice is now somehow theorized.
Mm.
There's nothing more theoretical than a good practice, which is, to me, it's practice-based evidence.
Mm.
Right? So that's a huge trend that I really welcome, because entire fields, especially psychology, they were really focused on outcome-based, outcome-based. But then now we are slowly moving our attention to, in addition to that, not instead of that, progress or process-based research. So I think that's a trend that I really welcome as a researcher. We need to look at not only does it work, outcome, but how does it work? And I think we need to look at both and see how do they connect to one another. Yeah.
And so interesting. So that idea of, we focus so much on the outcomes. When we think about communication, what is the process by which we get there? I know something you've talked about quite a lot is, and I'm curious how it connects here, is this idea of more human-centered approaches to communication. And we had here a recent episode of our podcast on AI innovation. What does that mean for humans at work? How are we at risk of being left behind? With all of that, and of course, it's it's such a big topic at the moment. What do you think are some of the challenges, things we need to be thinking about in terms of that AI, that sort of human-centered communication in our new world of rapid innovation, AI hybrid work, all of these sorts of things?
And probably the question that I will have for everyone actually is, what makes it uniquely human, especially when we show up at work, whether work is a place where we actually show up or work is an activity that we do. What makes it uniquely human? And I think for me, one of the things that I struggle with is how we name things. AI, why did we name it intelligence? We call it artificial intelligence. But is it intelligent? So that's one challenge that I actually face, because once we name something, it becomes a thing. So when we look around this creativity that humans bring to work, is, I think, what makes it uniquely human. And also when we think about this work conditions, how are we actually creating these work conditions so that we are getting people to be more creative and really play into their creativity? I think any change that we have, we don't know what's going to happen next. Who knows? And then there's a bit of fear, and there's a bit of dread. And with the dreaded future, I think human creativity actually prepares us. But I welcome that we still have this choice of how we're going to be coexisting with this invention of our own. At the same time, when we mean human-centered, what does that mean, especially between two people? And what does it mean for me to show up at work human-centered? And what does it mean to organize the work human-centered way? So that probably is the next big question. How do we organize? How do we set up the conditions? And how does it actually influence how we work? Because what makes it human is that we have this thing called what I call interfluence. And you and I actually build meanings together. And there's that generative idea, or something gets generated. But then when we call a machine something that it's information gathering and possibly even filtering, and we call it generative artificial intelligence, I think it might be misleading. Yeah. And with that, I think one of the challenges that we have right now in workplace, I hear many times people say, I'm exhausted.
Yeah.
AI is supposed to make it easier for you. But I'm so scattered, I'm exhausted. I hear that many times. And I think this we are fragmented. In a way, I almost feel like collectively we're experiencing this attention deficit and hyperactivity. Like it's induced.
Yeah.
Don't you feel that way?
Yeah, and it's yeah, I hear a lot about this kind of concept of attention economy, right? So you just with so much data information, the rate of processing and what comes at us, that the most precious commodity of all is our attention.
Absolutely.
And we probably all feel that quite personally in ways, you know, how our attention spans maybe not what they once were, or at least it feels that way.
Yes.
So
Yeah, absolutely. There are 7 different devices going, and especially when we're moving from in-person, face-to-face dialogue to online, which is very convenient and efficient. And then thinking, what are we losing?
Yeah.
And what's the price we pay for convenience? And I often think that when you jump from one online meeting to another meeting as if you're just teleported, we don't have the time that we usually have when we're either commuting or when we are going from one room to another room for a meeting. You have the time to walk and process.
Yeah.
And information gets sort of defragged. But then now, those fragmented information is not really processed, but we still go to another one. Of course, we are tired.
Yeah, I think it's I really relate to that feeling actually of what you just described. I think it's beautifully put, of just when you go from one online meeting to the next online meeting, there's no time to decompress. You know, there isn't. You lack the space that you have perhaps in person to just connect, warm up a little bit, and then a little bit of space in between your next meeting. What do you think are some of the 2 or 3 of the big differences in terms of how we communicate in person versus online for having a conversation? Like, what do you see as some of those big differences?
I think there are different rules actually when you are doing it online. For example, how do you know when somebody's about to speak? It's a very simple thing, but in person, we kind of know because we have multimodal information we're gathering. So I can tell by maybe you just opened your mouth. Maybe you did that, so you're about
the
to speak.
nonverbal kind of cues.
There are a lot of things that we can actually pick up just visibly and also audibly. And I think online, it's mimicking a lot of that and preserving it. But at the same time, we have this rule of hold your hand up or digital hand up. And I think different rules that we actually somehow constructed. But one very interesting though is when I do coaching online, and there are some research that are just emerging in this, that when people are doing online coaching, we can actually do research by eye tracking. So we see where your eyes are when you're looking at yourself or when you're looking at your coach. And we look at how many times, what percentage of the time do you actually look at yourself? And right now, some preliminary research that I've done is actually more than 60% of the time.
You're looking at yourself?
They look at themselves. And I think one of the positive impacts of that is that they do self-editing, I think. That's
self-editing?
That's hypothesis. Because it's almost like you are looking in the mirror. You kind of see yourself talk, and then you sort of edit yourself. And I find it quite fascinating. Not good, not bad, I don't know, but fascinating.
Tiring? I mean that's my...
Is it tiring? Maybe.
My sense is that just seeing your own image all the time, it's a bit, like the feedback that you get constantly is...
Yeah, maybe. And then it's almost like it's 2 of you speaking, but it's actually there are 3 of you. There's the coach, and then the person who is watching you, that's you, and then also the person who is performing. So it's almost like having 3 people in the room of 2, right? So that's online. It's almost like having a mirror behind you right now.
Yeah.
So I find that fascinating, actually.
I'm
sure there will be a lot more research coming out of that. Yeah.
And thinking about, obviously, the big social experiment that we've all been through with hybrid work, everybody moving
massive
in that direction. We had Nick Caesar on here recently talking to us about that, the trade-offs that we experience. And I'd love your perspective on this, Haesun. Like, what are some of many of our listeners here will be in that exact experience. They have hybrid teams that they are trying to manage. Do you have any advice, insights from the research that you've seen of things that we can do to just foster better conversations in that sort of online and in-person world?
Whether it's online or in person, I think what we are probably lacking right now is that space and time for a dialogue. And that dialogic nature that we share is, I think, uniquely human. Maybe with AI, you can actually, even AI bots, right? You can actually have conversation. You can carry on a conversation or mimicking conversation because it accumulates information from previous things, but it doesn't really generate. And when I say dialogue, I actually stay very close to David Bohm's idea of dialogue, which is generative. Dialogue. It's like dia, it's through, log as in words. So it's through words, something gets generated. It's very different from discussion. Like discussion has cushion in it. That means to break it apart, as in like concussion or percussion. You hit something, you break apart. And if we're having discussion, we are making decisions. We actually do pros and cons, and we make decisions. A lot of business meetings are run that way. So while we're here, we have to make a decision. And then even the word deciding actually has side in it. That means to kill. As in
kill off another idea or
kill off options. So here's a big topic. Let's have a discussion and make it into 5 small topics and then kill off all the other options but survive one. It's that problem-solving approach that a lot of businesses do. What we are lacking is a space and time for dialogue where ideas are not killed but generated. What else? That elsing needs to happen. And I think one example that we often talked about is, can half a word actually make a difference? And that's the research that was recently shared. And when sociolinguists, they get together and do research, they do something fascinating, such as in a medical setting, asking patients this one question with half a word variation. One is, do you have something else that you would like to tell me? Or do you have anything else you would like to tell me? And the huge difference between actually patients in one group, do you have something else? And they're more than 70% of the time, they're more likely to say, yes, I do have something else. And I think that difference is not insignificant. That subtle change of half a word, but significant impact, because that reduces patients' unmet needs by over 70%. That is incredible, isn't it?
Absolutely. I remember you sharing this research with me before, and it's stuck with me as such a powerful small change, but the impact that has on the conversation and how it invites people in or not. Can you tell us a little bit about why, though? Why, what's your sociolinguistic view on like why some versus any?
And I think it's because we are so used to, so when we see a phenomenon like that, and then we ask people, so why did it happen like that? We have so many views, and mostly they're coming from, well, it's because internal psychological process, but then a simpler way of looking at it is the habit of language. So especially in English, the habit of language is when I learned English, it started with, so choose the right word, fill in the blanks. And first example, I have blank ideas. Do you use some or any? I'm like, oh, and then I had to learn it that way. And I have any idea. That sounds weird. I have some idea. Or you will say, oh, I don't have friends. It says some or any. Well, so it's a habit of language. There's not real reason why, but it seems that when you say some, it indicates presence of something. I have some friends, some ideas, some money. Whereas when you say any, it means absence. I don't have any. Fill in the blanks. So I feel that that habit of language actually sort of invites, because it's a mutual process. So when I say, so if as a teacher, any questions? And people are like, oh, time to pack my bag. And then that's a habit of language. Whereas if you actually stop the class and then say, so what questions do you have at this point? Not even like, what are some questions? I simply say, what questions do you have at this point? All of a sudden, people have questions. Because that's a mutual habit that we know how to play. Right?
I think this is a really like practical insight we can take away, thinking about, one-to-ones, team meetings,
absolutely,
how we invite people to make it safe.
Change, exactly.
To ask questions. I love that. And I suppose thinking, another as we talk about the power of of small words, one word, how that frames a conversation. And something, Haesun, that we hear a lot from the clients that we work with is about inclusion, DEI. How do we what people are worried about talking about difference, what's the right kind of language they should use. Do you have any advice, perspectives on that? Do you got me straight away. So would you have some
thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I think when we label stuff, like we name stuff, and I just love how we name it and we are actually then obligated to deal with what comes after. An example of calling something diversity. I mean, throughout the pandemic, I really didn't like it when people kept on calling it social distancing, because it's not social distancing, it's actually physical distancing for the social good.
Yeah.
So I struggle with naming it a certain way. An example of diversity, and I often lament about how diversity it's not the right fit, because when you want to talk about diversity, you need to also talk about the norm. So I often say, if you actually invite diversity to a party, then they will always bring their norm.
Yeah.
And then we can move the norms around, but still we are not really, because we called it diversity. But let's say Professor Ken Gergen introduces this word multiplicity or multiple legitimacy. People who are sitting at this table, multiple voices, multiplicity. Now, if you invite multiplicity to a party, multiple show up. And there's no one norm.
Yeah.
That's one.
Yeah. So
right?
is it the idea then that multiplicity is like inherently like not value free? So whereas diversity's got like there is a norm
There's
from
a
which
norm.
everything else deviates.
Yes.
Is that the
diverges from, right? And
yeah.
another thing about inclusion, for example, I mean, inclusion has closure. So here is the line.
Yeah.
You are either in or out. And how do we determine?
Yeah.
So there is that value judgment when we say inclusion. So people often ask me, so how does your coaching practice speak to DEI and all those things? I'm like, I don't know how to answer that because I don't understand the question. But what I know that I do is that I stay very close to the client's language, their logos in our dialogue. And by doing that, I am actually containing as much as I can about their logic of them doing their life. Because after this conversation is over, they're going to continue to live their life. Why am I adding my logos in their life? Because it will be quite irrelevant. And the way that I respect my clients is preserving their language, believing that they must have a reason to actually use those language or languaging their realities that way. And often when I get people who don't speak the same language as I do, and they're like, oh, I don't know how to say this in English. I'm like, that's totally fine. How would you say it? And they're like, oh, it's like this in my language. Or even gestures. Preserve it. That contains so much of their worldview, how they do their life. And I think that's how we stay respectful, respecting their uniqueness. And whether you call it diversity or inclusion, I think it's really respecting and upholding the client, beholding, right? So that's what I think about. Those are some of the thoughts.
Yes, some of your thoughts. I think that will give people a lot of food for thought, indeed, because there is a lot of, I think, even discussion around the terms, DEI, at the moment. And I think, that's a really interesting way of, turning that on its head, actually, and actually being very deliberate about the sort of the language that we use. I'd love to just get your thoughts on, so we've talked a little bit about communicating in the world of AI, in our hybrid world. We've talked about what it looks like in terms of our language for inclusion, for increasing belonging. And then within all of that, we have this other really interesting question, which is around generational difference. And I'm always a little bit cynical personally about generational differences, because I just think individual differences are so so extensive within any generation. Can we really make these big claims? And yet, I still think there are probably some high level things that we just even see anecdotally. I suppose what jumps out for you, Haesun, as some of those big generational differences that you see in how people communicate today?
I think it's called generation because they generate their own unique cultural or some sort of norms that they actually get.
Yeah.
Especially, I love how these young people, they use these slangs. And I'm like, what does it even mean? But it means something. And then I'm just learning something every day when my nephews come home and they're like, yeah, that's like so this. I'm like, that what? How do you even spell that? But I think we often take on this stance of criticizing.
Yeah.
Just because, you guys don't know any better versus, well, that is really cool. Like, what do you mean? How does it come? Like, how did you come up with that? And I think with that, what's important actually sort of evolves over time. I mean, in our time, we had our this like cultural way of doing stuff. And that's what we call culture because that shared meaning accumulates over time. But nowadays, I feel that there's a lot broader meanings that are shared or dictated, for example. So I'm not saying younger or older generation. I'm talking about the generation of our time.
Yeah.
When we didn't have these phones, those slangs were much more localized.
Yeah.
But now with emojis and all those things, that's dictated by. So we don't get to make our own emojis, but emojis are provided for us. And then now we need to learn how to express certain things. So for example, I remember this priest, he a lovely priest, and he actually got this text message from one of his parishioners, a young person. And he said, Father, I just lost my grandma. And the priest is like, I'll be praying for your son and all those things. And at the end of it, he actually signed LOL. And then this young person is like, what's going on here? And then we asked the priest, like, Father Dave, LOL, I'm not sure. And he actually thought it meant lots of love. So that's one.
That's very sweet.
And then when you have slightly different, like, out of tune, shared meaning, that's how it shows up. But when it's textual, it's difficult to mitigate that misunderstanding. When it's face to face, you know exactly what to do.
Yes.
Another one is another sort of generational sort of like funny thing is this young child actually emailing grandson, texting grandma saying, "Grandma, I just won this award," and grandma saying, "Oh, WTF." This young kid is like, "Oh my gosh, what?" And grandma thought it actually meant, "Well, that's fantastic." So it's really cute to see some of these misunderstandings play out. But imagine we have different rules for different sort of language games, so to speak, as Wittgenstein will call it. I actually had a case where my student in their final report, typed up report for a graduate course, they actually typed LOL after they made a comment. I was just so offended. And I almost wrote WTF. It's like, what is this? You don't do this here. But then I'm thinking, but why not?
Yeah.
This is how we communicate.
Yeah.
This is the words of our generation. And why am I all of a sudden so offended by seeing LOL in this context?
It's so funny. It's
right?
Do you think that idea of all generations probably have had this tendency to prejudge the newer. I'm thinking.
Oh, I bet.
I'm thinking of that famous story. I don't know if you've heard this of Paul McCartney talks about his father when he was writing "She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah," that famous Beatles song, and they were finishing writing it in the living room of their house in Liverpool, and his dad said to him, apparently, "Wouldn't it be much better if it was she loves you, yes, yes, yes." yeah, just sounds so American and slang and not proper. And they're like, you don't get it. And I think it's a great story of, like, of course now we think, That would have been a terrible song. But it's a nice example of
It's almost creepy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So do you think that is just our natural like tendency to always prejudge new types of language and forms of communication?
I think it's one of those things that it will continue to happen, and it's been happening with every language. Every language that has, even in the ancient sort of inscription on the wall, really, they have this. People had to translate that somebody was lamenting about, the modern generation. And we're talking about like 280 or something.
Wow.
And there's kids these days. And
Yeah.
I think this will continue to happen. But then it's not about dividing. We're not trying to divide different generations do this, but how do we really embrace and include? I actually think our new generations, they do have superpower.
Yeah.
They know how to do certain things that I didn't know how to do, like speak up, for example, or mobilizing, and all those things that I didn't know how to do. Also, I think they're under a very specific pressure that many of my generation may not know about. I mean, for example, growing up, bye mom, bye dad, and I will leave home, and until I get home, they don't know what I'm doing, actually.
Yeah.
And I will just go home when I can smell like dinner.
Yeah.
And then they're like, oh, okay, you're home, great, eat. And next day I go out and who knows what's going to happen. But then these days, all the kids have like whereabouts and parents can check. And I actually think that pressure is quite a bit, that not being able to sort of grow up independent. And I think that's a tremendous pressure that we actually see in younger generation, right? So, so I don't actually look at younger people with like, rolling eyes. I never do that because they have that pressure that we don't know about.
Yeah.
And they're somehow managing through it. I think it's incredible.
You mentioned, thinking of this younger generation communicating in different ways. You mentioned using, emojis, GIFs, all these sorts of things. Looking at it now in a kind of professional work context and thinking about etiquette, if we can use that term, is there any interesting research or insights out there on the use of these in the sort of professional language? Like one could imagine that, at least I've read something around overuse of emojis, for example, can lead to the perception of a lack of competence, whereas on that kind of classic sort of matrix of warmth competence, there is also kind of contradictory research which is about showing this gives a suggestion of warmth, of inclusion, of a little bit more spontaneity, maybe not expected from more leaders within an organization. Just curious if you have.
I do have anecdotes.
Yeah,
a few of them. Because I remember actually sending. Somebody told me that you can say anything in your email if you just put a smiley face, it makes everything better. And I'm thinking there's a time and place for that. I mean, you can't really say you're fired, smiley face. And there are some messages that needs to be done in person, just out of respect. For example, don't fire somebody over an email or over an announcement, or please don't break up with somebody, like digitally. That's so rude. Or just recently, my nephew did something. He offended, his mom. And we were talking about certain behaviors. He's like, but I apologized. And how? I texted her. Yeah. And we're saying, is that how she would like to receive apology? And he's like, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry is I'm sorry, in person or over the text. I'm like, And then that tension that I felt at that moment, it's like, is it? And I don't want to incorrect him, but at the same time, there's something about that apology that I prefer to get it in person because then I can respond. Yeah. What makes it human is that we exchange. Yeah. And we call it calibration. That's something that in communication we talk about, how you say something and I show you that I understand what you mean, and then you then say, yes, you got what I was trying to say. The calibration sequence is 3-step. You say something, I actually show that I acknowledge that, and you acknowledge that. And that kind of calibration is the building blocks of meaning making. And those meanings are made through that countless calibration. As you're nodding right now, you're calibrating, right? We're actually doing that right now, which is not done over text.
Yeah.
You don't know how they're going to be, you don't know the time and space where they are at. So I might be in a happy party place, and it's like, oh, I'm so sorry about what happened. But then that person might be in toilet puking, who knows? And then that distance, we don't know how that message will land. So the gap between what I said and what you hear is a lot more pronounced over text messages or text-mediated communication. Although a lot of youth now, they feel much more comfortable doing counseling over texts rather than face-to-face. Because especially when they have to talk about embarrassing things, they don't have to show their face. But then is it, I don't know if it's useful.
So
is it useful?
So I'm curious to kind of, just to pick up on a couple of things you just said there. So what I'm hearing is the risk of things getting lost in translation is higher, right? So in text-mediated communication, I love that point about the three-step calibration, the things that we don't even think about, the imperceptible, but clearly we're making meaning and we're making connections without even realizing it. When you have all these
making eye contact
nonverbal cues, try making eye contact with an AI, exactly. And then this example that you shared of in counseling, therapy settings, maybe I imagine where shame may be involved is often, at least some of the research I've seen, is where people feel most comfortable sharing with perhaps an AI based therapist, coach, rather than a human. But then you said, but is it useful?
Is it useful? And the question when I say, what's interesting is a lot of people say, oh, it's this, which modality is better? It's like, I don't know which is better. But I think it's talking about your horrible past. Is it useful? Sure, I'm sure it's useful, but is it necessary? For people to make useful changes? Do we have to? Is it necessary for us to talk about our troubled past? Is it necessary to talk about our dreaded future? It might be useful, but there's a gap between what's useful and what's necessary. And when I look at especially people who are reluctant to do coaching or therapy or whatnot, they're more open to doing it online and text-based. But the misinterpretation is somebody might be saying, I'm doing relatively okay. And depending on what emoji you put and the context that we read that in changes. Somebody actually, that happened about 6 weeks ago. Somebody said, I'm finally finding some peace. And then they had this face that looked kind of like smiling and I'm okay face. And then I wasn't sure about that. But then I'm like, okay, I think they're okay. I would never know. So I actually phoned them. And you talked about this telephobia. People are now shocked that you would just phone before checking.
That's scheduling.
Is this a good time to call? I mean, I come from a culture and time when you actually show up to somebody's door.
Me too.
Right? It's like, oh my God, you just called. And I think calling her was really useful and necessary because she was sobbing when she actually texted me that. And by looking at the text and emoji, I wouldn't know. But then just phoning, even phoning, I don't see her, but that audible, that made all the difference, right? So I just find it slightly risky just to rely on text-mediated communication. And I think emails and text messages and all those things are only maybe it's making it easier for sure, convenience. But what price are we paying for that convenience? For example, when you order something, sure, next day delivery, same day delivery, convenient, but what price are we paying? Globally, what price are we paying?
Such a great question, quite profound actually. And I wonder, just as we kind of start to round up the conversation, just thinking about your advice for us, and I know you talk a lot, Haesun, about better conversations, more conversations. what is the one thing you'd want people to take away when we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, the risks in our digital text mediated world, but what was like one thing you'd want people to sort of think about to do differently, perhaps?
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, here's an interesting response to that is that I'll respond to that as a researcher.
Mm-hmm.
There is this push to make things simpler. So the books that sell the most, it's like, oh, 3 key
Yep.
tips on something, or one takeaway, as we were talking about this one takeaway. And this attractiveness of reductionism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we confuse that and we misuse that. So, for example, Alexander Luria, I think is his name, who is a Russian neuropsychologist, I would say. And with Janet Bavelas from Victoria, Canada, they talk about this idea of reductionism. And there's a good reason to reduce certain things. I mean, it makes it easier for us to understand. That's why we classify stuff. And we name all these different things, and then so that we can sort of differentiate. At the same time, what they talk about is if you want to study water, okay, then you need to study water. The minute that you reduce water to its elements, hydrogen and oxygen, hydrogen burns, oxygen helps at burning. But when they come together, it becomes water. It does not have any of those qualities because it's a new thing. And when you reduce it down to its elements, it completely loses it. It loses nature. So when I actually see team conversations or dialogues or things that we want to know more about, we have this tendency to break it down smaller than its usefulness. For example, coaching studies a lot of times talk about, let's study questions. Let's study what coaches do. Oh, good coach, you do this. Okay, let's make it into the textbook and let's do this. It doesn't work like that. That meaning was not made just one-sided. That if you want to study how dialogues work, you have to study the dialogue, not what this person did or that person did. We need to study what they did together. When you think about workplace conversations, team conversations, and sending managers to do, here's a communication class, that's a one-sided way of doing it. So even one-on-one coaching, I find that a little bit removed from actual meaning making. So I personally love team conversations when everyone show up and they can actually do meaning making right there, right? So I think one takeaway after saying all that is I wonder how we can create more space, intentional space for dialogues and have more conversations and have them better. Right?
Yeah. That's quite a what I love about that is it's so refreshing. You know, it really, in our world of efficiency and productivity, this is quite a refreshing take, actually, creating the space for more dialogue, better conversations. And, you know, we started off, Haesun, talking about this question of, in our digital age, is how we communicate in sync or out of tune? What do you think our answer is after all of this that we've covered today?
It comes down to, I'm a musician, and I've been music for, that's my longest career, actually. And especially working in a band. You playing is secondary to listening to what's happening. If I'm just playing my thing, it's not good. It's not a good music. I need to be listening to make sure that am I in sync, the rhythm, the tone, and the mood, and the key, I guess. And also, am I also out of tune or in tune? And that's something that you need to be watching, calibrating all the time. So I think for me, closer steps to answering that question will be Are we listening? What kind of listening room do we have in our workplaces? What are we listening for? Because whatever you listened for will grow. And that's why if you're listening to each other around, what do they care about? What's important to you? What is that you want? Then we're now opening up more space for generative dialogues. Because a lot of times when we when we actually send leaders to training, it's about how to speak so that they will listen. Well, no, we need to send them to do a training how to listen so that they can speak. And that's a big gap that we see still in communication in workplaces. How do we teach people to actually be quiet and listen? I would love to attend a training session where all these leaders come and just sit and learn to listen to one another. Wouldn't that be so fascinating? You learn to listen.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, Haesun, I have loved listening to you. I have loved dialoguing with you, calibrating, communicating. It's been such a pleasure. I think we have covered such rich, interesting topics today. Everything from generational differences, how can we be more human-centric in our approach? How do we really create space for true dialogue? How do we think about what gets lost in translation? And some of the trade-offs, I think, of a world that is more efficient, more productive, but at what price when it comes to human connection and dialogue. So thank you for your wonderful insights, your great humor, and being with us today.
What are you taking away?
So personally, I am. I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways is this point that you shared here about listening and actually how intentional we are sometimes about getting things across and transmitting and making decisions and not leaving that space for true listening, truly generating the spontaneity that can come from that. So I think that's going to give me some food for thought.
It would be wonderful if workplaces actually have meetings with no agenda.
Yes, meetings with no agenda. Maybe that's our next podcast episode. Well, thank you, Haesun, for a absolutely fascinating conversation. And as ever, we would love to hear your thoughts. Specifically, what is the emoji that you use the most in a professional work setting? Don't forget to subscribe and share, and we look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of EZRA Asks.